Welcome back to another video. This week I'm going to be making some summer PJs. I'm looking for a set that's like a really nice classic PJ, you know, like shirt and trouser type of thing, but I want it to be shorts and a short sleeve top. So I'm thinking about hacking this pattern right here from Burda. This is from their December 2021 issue. It's a unisex, like classic pajama set. As for fabric, I'm going to be using some really lovely fabric. This is a cotton sateen from Minerva, and the print is called Floral Expression. I love this. It's so soft, and this is going to make like the comfiest and most luxurious pair of PJs ever. So I'm really excited to work with it. I have worked with their cotton sateen range before, and it is really good and nice to work with. So I'm excited. The other thing that I want to be adding to this pajama set is some ricrac. It's not about piping, but I don't have any piping cord or fabric to make piping out of. I don't really want to go out and buy piping, so I'm going to add ricrac instead at the edges and kind of add a little scalloped edge. Let's get started. Let me show you how I actually hack this pattern and do all of that.
So to get started on this pattern hack, you need to get your tape measure. That's step 1. Step 2 is realize you don't have anywhere to write your measurements down on. And step 3 is getting some pen and paper. For the arm measurement, I'm measuring the length of the sleeve I want from the seam of the sleeve I'm wearing. You want to measure down from the shoulder. Doing this with someone is helpful, but if you don't have anyone around, do it in front of a mirror so you can see the numbers. For the legs, you can measure from your crotch down to the length you want, or from the waist. I went with crotch measurement today because this pattern has a folding down waistband and I didn't feel like doing additional math, but I'll explain this in a minute. The other measurement you need for this PJ set is your waist measurement for the elasticated waistband. Obviously, don't take your measurements in, outside clothes like I'm doing here. I'd say either do it in your underwear or very thin garments, but I don't really want to do that on the internet, so do as I say and not as I do. Now that we have all measurements all ready to go, it's time to transfer them to our pattern. Starting with the sleeve, I'm using the same tape measure to mark my new length, starting at the stitching line. We have to ignore the seam allowance here because we didn't include it when we measured our arms. And also, sometimes tape measures stretch out, and that's why I'm using the same one. Once I've marked that on the pattern from the shoulder tip, I draw a straight line across the sleeve and add a seam allowance. I'm adding 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch, which is what I have on the rest of this pattern. Depending on how much you're reducing and the shape of the pattern piece, you could just fold it back and use the same pattern piece, or you can be a little bit extra like me and trace it over to make a new pattern piece. Either way is fine, just do what works for you. And if you do trace the pattern, don't forget to transfer all of the markings over as well. For the legs, if you measured from your waist, you would just do the exact same thing we did for the arms. With this pattern being a fold down waistband, and I wasn't really sure how much I was going to fold down, and I didn't want to work it out right here, which is what I meant by doing extra math. So what I did instead is I took the front leg pattern piece and drew a line from the tip of the crotch across the leg, keeping the line parallel to the waistband. And then I marked my new length from this line. I drew my new stitching line and added some seam allowance. And then for the back of the leg, I simply placed the back piece over the front, matched the crotch seam so that I could trace the lines over. Now it's business as usual. I folded my fabric with right sides together and placed the pattern pieces on there. This print isn't directional, so you don't really have to worry about placing the pieces the right way out. I also decided to shorten the bodice of the top, so I kind of eyeballed it. Once I had folded back the amount I wanted to reduce on the back piece, I measured how much I had folded so that I could fold the same amount on the front piece. Once I had all of the pieces pinned to the fabric, I cut them all out. I've left the fabric, pattern, and any of the tools and materials I used in this video linked for you in the description as always. And now I'm realizing that I didn't show you how I cut the cuffs for the sleeves, but I just took the original sleeve cuffs and shortened them for the measurement of my arm plus seam allowance. Today we're doing batch sewing as always, so starting off by pinning everything we possibly can at this point. First, I pinned the sleeve cuffs along the short edges with right sides together. Next, I pinned the rise seam, which is the seam that goes from the waistband to the crotch. You want to pin the back pieces to each other along the rise with right sides together, and repeat that for the front pieces too. My system here is to unpin the pattern piece, transfer any markings, and then pin. So next, I pinned the front and back bodice pieces with right sides together at the shoulders and sides. The pieces I can't pin right now, I put to the side. I also cut out some interfacing for the collar and fused it. And yes, I did piece it together because we do have to use those weird interfacing offcuts somehow. The last thing I'm doing before I start sewing these together is pinning some ricrac to the collar piece. Because I want it to form a scalloped edge, I need to be stitching it so that the center of the trim is on the stitching line. So when I turn the collar right side out, only half of the ricrac is visible, creating the scallop. Now I could just sandwich some ricrac in between the collar pieces and hope for the best, but I am not quite that chaotic in my sewing, so I like to stitch it down along the stitching line on one piece first, and then sew the pieces together like I would normally, without having to worry about the placement of the ricrac and without having to unpick the seam when it inevitably comes out wonky. I folded back the seam allowance on one of the pieces to make future steps easier, and then I trimmed the seam allowances on the collar pieces. Then I added 2 rows of gathering stitches to the hem of the sleeves and at the sleeve cap. 2 rows of gathering stitches make life much easier when you're working with gathers, so if you hate gathering but you haven't tried 2 rows of gathering stitches, you need to try it before you decide if you actually hate it. I speak from personal experience. Oh, and if you hate it because you don't want to have to remove the stitches, just do them in the seam allowance and then you don't have to remove them at all. Anyway, next I stitched the underarm seam closed as well as all of the other things that I had pinned earlier. I stitched everything in a row and then I cut the threads in between. I think this is called chain stitching. I learned it from quilters online and it saves quite a bit of time and quite a bit of thread. Now for finishings, you can use your serger if you have one, but I know it's a big investment, not to mention it takes up space that you may not have, and oftentimes we'll say just use a zigzag stitch but never actually show you how to, so I'm showing you how to. First you trim the seam allowance down. I like to leave at least 1/2 centimeter, which is like 3/8 of an inch, I think. If you use the imperial system, you might want to Google that one to be sure. The vital thing here is the settings on your machine. Reduce the stitch length so you get a really nice tight zigzag and increase your stitch width to the max. And I'm going to use a regular plain zigzag stitch, nothing fancy. Then you line up the raw edge with the needle and the stitching line and make sure you're encasing the raw edge in your stitches. Play around with the different settings on a scrap of the same fabric until you find a setting that you like. That's what I did. But once you got those down, just trim the seams and sew them along the edges to get a really lovely faux overlocker look on your regular sewing machine. When I had all of my seams zigzagged, I pressed them all, typically pressing them towards the back. For the sleeve cuffs, I also pressed them in half lengthwise and pressed the seam allowance in on one of the sides. For the collar, I turned it right side out and pressed it flat, making sure I had those rounded corners out properly, and then I pressed the seam allowance in on the uninterfaced side, which I had already stitched with the edges in this position. And now we start pinning again. I pinned the front and back of the shorts together along the sides from the waist to the hem, which is called the out seam. And I also pinned the inseam, which is the one from the crotch to the hem of both legs. When you pin the inseam, make sure you match the center seams. This is around the time I realized that I forgot to cut out pockets, but I also was too lazy to go back and cut them out, unpick, redo everything, so I just kept going. I'm also pinning the interfaced side of the collar to the bodice with right sides together, matching the centers. If you didn't mark the centers, don't worry, just fold the collar in half and put a pin in the center point. You can do the same thing for the back piece by lining up the shoulder seams and folding it in half from there. Pin the center point, and then you can match the 2 pins and continue pinning out from there. Then I pinned the sleeves to the cuffs, again with right sides together. You want to be pinning the edge you didn't press the seam allowance in on. If you did the same as me for the cuff, then you'll need to pull on those gathering stitches to make the sleeve fit the cuff. I like to match up the seams of the sleeve and cuff and then tie off the gathering threads on one side and pull on the other until the sleeve and cuff are the same size. Then you can arrange the gathers to your liking and pin the rest of the pieces together. Now I can sew those seams, taking care not to catch the folded edges of either the cuffs or the collar. Next, I went ahead and trimmed the seam allowances on the inseam, outseam, and the sleeve cuffs. I'm going to press the seam allowance of the sleeves over to the inside of the cuffs with the help of my seam rule. Then I'm going to fold the cuff so that the folded edge covers the seam I just pressed. Usually I would stitch this by hand on the inside, but today I decided to sew it on the machine. So on the outside, I'm pinning the folded edge in place. Next, I started working on the front opening edges before I did anything to the collar seam. This is not my first time making this pattern, so I knew it would make the finishing of the collar way easier. So I stitched some ricrac to the stitching line of the fronts, just like I did for the collar, and then pinned the front facings to the fronts with right sides together. The reason I didn't finish the collar is so that I could stitch the facing to the collar and have that seam hidden, which meant I had to be really careful around the collar area when sewing this, so I wouldn't catch the uninterfaced side. Next, I trimmed the seam allowances on the facings and the collar seam. I could now turn the facings to the inside and press them in place, and also press that little bit of exposed seam allowance of the collar at the back towards the collar. This does mean you have to clip those seam allowances, so the whole seam will be hidden when you sew the folded edge of the collar down. Then I zigzagged the outseam and the inseam of the shorts and the raw edges of the front facings as well. And I also pressed those seams on the shorts. To prep the waistband, I started by pressing in the seam allowance along the whole top of the waistband. Then I folded along the line marked in the pattern, which I believe was around 5 centimeters or 2 inches, but I can't remember for sure. But I went ahead and pressed that in place as well. Next, I top stitched the cuffs in place, and I also added some ricrac to the bottom edge of the cuff, keeping the trim along the inside and top stitching it in place, so it still had the same scalloped edge effect. And now I also top stitched the waistband in place, but left a little gap so I can insert the elastic in there. Before I added the elastic, I just slip stitched the folded edge of the collar down to the facings and to the seam allowance of the back. I'm waxing my thread because it helps it tangle up less and it just makes sewing by hand a lot easier. I've been doing this for a long time, but I don't think I often show it on camera. Also, I don't know if you can hear Zeus, but he is hanging out with me, so sorry about that. To add the elastic, you want to cut out a piece that is slightly smaller than your waist, depending on how tight you want the band to be. I'm using 3 centimeter wide elastic, that's 1 inch and 3/8, I think. And I actually did my exact waist measurement because I don't want these to be tight at all, and I want them to be able to accommodate weight fluctuations and bloating. I burn the edges to keep them from fraying, and then I use a big and sturdy safety pin to thread my elastic through the waistband. Make sure you don't let the opposite end into the waistband just yet, or you have to start all over again. When you get the safety pin and back out through the gap, join the 2 ends, making sure the elastic isn't twisted up inside the waistband. If it is, you just have to untwist it now carefully so you can join the ends of the elastic with right sides together using a zigzag stitch. Then you can let the elastic into the waistband completely and stitch the gap closed. You may have to pull on it to make sure that you avoid getting tucks in your seam. To finish up the shorts, all there's left to do is to hem them. I just turned the raw edge up twice, eyeballing the seam allowance, because I've learned with my experience I can eyeball a 1.5 seam allowance with 99% accuracy, but if you have not yet developed this sewing skill, then use a seam gauge. I've linked the one I used in the description. I used clips to hold that in place and then moved on over to the sewing machine where I top stitched the hem in place while I attached the ricrac too. I'm doing this in the same way that I did for the sleeves. You could also pin the ricrac in place, but again, experience here means I can cut some corners. Then it's time to move on to setting in your sleeves in the bodice. So setting sleeves in can be a bit overwhelming, so I'm going to try and give you a more comprehensive explanation today. There's usually a right and left sleeve, and patterns will normally have a notch or more to illustrate which one is which. So on the bodice, for most commercial patterns, there's 2 notches on the back of the bodice around the armhole area and 1 on the front of the bodice. And on the sleeve, you'll have 1 notch on one side and 2 on the other. All you have to do to get the right sleeve in the right place is to match those notches. Now, Burda is a little different as always in that it only has 1 notch on the front and 1 notch on the sleeve and no double notches on the back. So you just match those as well. Once I've figured out which sleeve goes where, I start pinning the sleeve to the armhole with right sides together. I like to match up the underarm seam first to make sure that they line up and then work out from there. Sleeves always have what we call ease, which is why you have gathering stitches to help you ease them in. Normally you pull on the gathering stitches like I did for the sleeve cuffs to help you fit the sleeves into the armhole. It will look like there's tucks, but they will actually only be on the seam allowance side and not on the actual stitching line. Now I'm a sucker for a puffy sleeve, so I actually don't ease my sleeves in. What I tend to do is use that extra ease to create more fullness at the shoulder. The way I do that is by pulling up all of the ease into the shoulder seam and then doing tucks, pleats, gathers, whatever I feel like on the day or for that specific sleeve. Today I did a little box pleat. To do the box pleat, you pin the fabric up until the shoulder so that all of the excess is right at that seam. And then you split the excess so that there's an equal amount on each side of the seam and pin that in place. When sewing, you can remove the arm of your sewing machine to help you maneuver the fabric more easily. But even if you don't do that, take it slow, make sure you're not getting any tucks, and check your seam is the way you want it to be before you move on. If you have any more specific questions about the sleeves or anything else, please leave me a comment or send me a message on Instagram and I'd be happy to help you out. To finish off the facings, I like to fold the facings to the outside and stitch it down at the seam allowance, then trim the facing and clip the corners before flipping it back to the inside. This creates a really lovely seamless finish. And I also went ahead and tacked the facings down to the shoulder seam allowance to keep them in place. Next, I pressed all of those seams. I used my Tailor's ham to help with the armhole seams and then pressed the facings in place at the bottom. You'll notice when you do this that the hem wants to turn up, and that is exactly what we want it to do. I like to press the whole hem up by whatever amount is included in the pattern and then tuck the raw edge into that fold and press again. You don't have to press. I certainly didn't do that for the shorts, but obviously this method is much more accurate and will create a more professional finish. I top stitched the hem in place, but you could also do this by hand if you want an invisible finish. The last thing we have to do here is the buttons, so I went into my button stash and found a match and used the buttons I picked out to figure out the size of the buttonholes. I explained the exact method I'm using here step by step in depth in last week's video, and I don't want to bore you, so I'll leave a card to that so you can check it out. I made the buttonholes over on the machine, and then I used the buttonholes to mark the placement of the buttons. Last but not least, I attached the buttons on my sewing machine, and then we are ready for the reveal.
Okay, so that's the reveal. It's very cute. I'm really happy with how that turned out. I like the sleeves. I think I probably could have made the cuff a little bit bigger just for comfort wise, but I think it'll be fine. And I am unsure about the length of the shorts. I think I might shorten them in the future, but I kind of want to like give this a go and see how I find it in everyday, sleep. And see before I decide to chop them off, because like once I chop it off, there's no coming back, Otherwise, absolutely love it. I think the finishing on the collar is really good, really cute. I love the ricrac. I love this pattern. The fabric is delicious. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's anything you'd like me to cover in future videos that maybe I didn't in this one. So let me know that in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel. I put out a new video every Friday at 4 p.m. WEST. You can also follow me on Instagram or TikTok. I have the links for that in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you in the next one.